Here's a question for you. How is it that the 1957 Chevrolet became an icon of the 50s? Well, I have a potential answer, and it might not be the same one you're thinking of. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a wonderful collection of more than 170 cars, each one telling a different story about what was happening in both the automotive world and America at that time. And this car right here, this 1957 Chevrolet, well, this is a very important chapter in that story. And before we get to talking about the 57 Chevrolet, we actually have to go back and talk a little bit about what was going on both in America and in Chevrolet during the mid-50s. Now, Chevrolet had really changed everything in 1955. When they came out with the car, they built the hot one, that 1955 Chevrolet. Some people call it the slab-sided Chevy or the shoebox Chevy, but boy, the look and style of that, radically different than that old pontoon fender 1954 version. 1955, everybody loved that design. 1956, they came out with a subtle redesign of it. It was the 1950s, of course. You had to have a different style every year. It had to be some significant changes. But as they looked down the road, they were beginning to look long-term at what they wanted to have their Chevrolets become. And they were starting to think about the 1959 Chevrolet and how it was going to look completely different than these cars. But they also had a problem. Through the grapevine, they were hearing about Chrysler's forward look, this new style that was going to be, well, just spectacular, over the top. And Ford, in fact, also was coming out with a new style for 1957. They began to look at their 1956 model and the subtle changes they were making for 1957 and thought, is this going to be enough? They really wanted to have the 1958 Chevrolet, which is really very different looking than this, move that up to 1957, but they realized they couldn't get that done. So they knew they had to take their 1956 Chevrolet and make some, well, let's call them subtle changes to it. And to do that, well, they had to have it subtle, but at the same time, something that people would catch and pay attention to. And Harley Earl, his goal was to say, well, let's take some Cadillac style, some Cadillac bling, right? Cadillac chrome, Cadillac sides, and put it on the 1957 Chevrolet. And that's exactly what they did. They took the car that was the 56, made some subtle changes, made it look a little bit lower, made it seem like it was a little bit longer, definitely made it a little bit blingier, and as a result, they came out with what a car has become, which is the icon of the 1950s. When people think of 1950s Chevrolets, when people think of the 1950 automobiles, the 1957 Chevrolet is the one everybody turns to. Part of it's because of that fin in the back, part of it's because of the chrome. Everything about this car just screams 1950s, but not just 1950s as in old, 1950s as in stylish. So let's take a moment, look around and talk about the style of this 1957 Chevrolet. The styling for the 1957 Chevrolet was both evolutionary and revolutionary at the same time. Obviously, this was an extension of that 1955 shoebox Chevy style that they came out with, evolved into 56, but 1957, well, they made some significant changes, and I think the front end is a very important part of that. 1956 had a much boxier look. For example, underneath the headlights, they had turn signals that were kind of rectangular sitting right here. For 1957, they moved them down here. Another significant change in 57 over 1956 was this curve right here. Instead of a straight boxy look, this gave it a more refined look. Of course, it's got the big, Cadillac-style Dagmars or bullets. Dagmars, of course, referring to a famous actress of the 1950s. And interestingly enough, because of this new bumper that they created for the 1957, the frame underneath is really a one-year-only frame because the mounting points for this front bumper are different than for the 55 and 1956 Chevrolet. So if you're restoring them, you have to know that. They also wanted a lower look to the 1957, and they achieved that a couple ways. One way was really simple. Instead of 15-inch wheels, they moved to 14-inch wheels. We're able to lower the car just a little bit. Ford had already done that. A number of other manufacturers are going to do that as well, but just lowering it just a little bit thanks to that. Another significant change they made was they moved the air induction system from being cowl mounted right here. If you look on a 55 or a 56, you'll see the little slats where the air would go inside. They moved it from being on top to up front. And in fact, when you see the headlights, these little eyebrow headlights for a 1957, they're completely different than a 1955 or 56. And if you look closely, there's a little wire mesh all the way around surrounding the headlights. That was the air induction system, both for the air conditioning or fresh air. So no longer did they have it coming in at the cowl at the top, now it was coming in right here. And if you're restoring a 1957 as a result, it's just a little bit more complex to make that happen. Going down the side, different style in terms of the way they did it, chrome going all the way back. We'll talk about that big fin at the back in a moment. But they also made some significant changes in the rear bumper as well. And you'll notice that this has, it's the Bel Air, this has the gold accents. This V was important. Not only was it a style touch underneath the scripted Chevrolet, but it also said you had a V8. And of course, the thing that confused the heck out of any gas station or service station guy back in the 1950s, if they didn't know what they were looking for, was this right here. That's where the gas cap was hidden underneath. Similar to what they did in 1956. 1955, it was actually on the side of the fender. But for 1957, that's the way they designed it, similar to the way they did it in 1956. I know, you thought I was ignoring them, but how could you possibly ignore these big, huge fins that are on the back of the 1957 Chevrolet? Now, in 1956, it had subtle fins. Now, you got to remember, the fins within the General Motors world really go back to 1948 in the Cadillac, when Harley Earl had those P38 style fins on the very back. But by the late 50s or the mid 50s, boy, fins were becoming bigger and bigger and bolder. And what's interesting about the fins on the 1957 Chevrolet is while they're big, they're not actually as big as you think they are. I mean, they come out and they have a nice extension on the back, but it's really this piece right here, this anodized aluminum panel that goes in here, that accentuates the size of the fins. It makes them seem like they're even bigger than they are. Of course, fins, now they reach their zenith, shall we say, their high point in 1959 between the Cadillac and, of course, the Chrysler products for 1959. But for 1957, this really, for Chevrolet, was going to be the biggest fin they were ever going to have. You got to remember, in 1958, they changed the body style completely, go with a completely different look. And by 1959, well, the fins for Chevrolet are gone. They go to a more of a horizontal look. But these fins for the 1957 were a bold statement, a great way to, once again, show off that 1950s tail fin style. But because of this anodized aluminum, because of this Bel Air script right here, this thing, when it would go by you, you would see it, it would just stand out. And truly, when you see pictures of the 1950s, a lot of times this right here is what they incorporate in to show, well, what the 1950s were like. It was all about style. Yeah, there was substance underneath, but the styling of this 1957 fin on the back of this 1957 Chevrolet, absolutely spectacular. But it was more than just the styling that made this 1957 Chevy an icon. It's also what was happening underneath the hood. Now, you have to remember, in 1955, when they released the Hot One, that new 1955 Chevy, they also came out with a new V8 engine. And really, it was the perfect answer at the right time. Not just V8. I mean, V8s have been done for quite some time, but it was the way they did it. A small block, the particular size, it was 265 cubic inches and significantly lighter. It produced the right kind of horsepower in the right size package. They had that same 265 engine for 1955 and 1956, and then in 1957 they said, let's take that engine and kind of make it just a little bit bigger. From 265 cubic inches, they moved it out to 283 cubic inches, just enough to give it a little bit more horsepower. Now, you could still get a 6-cylinder option, what was basically the old Blue Flame 6 engine, but an awful lot of people were opting for the V8. Now, if you chose the V8, it was going to cost you a whopping $25. That was for the 220 horsepower version. If you wanted something a little bit bigger, you wanted a 245 model, well, that was going to cost you $55. And if you just wanted carburation, the top version you could get was going to be a 270 horsepower edition that was going to cost you a whopping $370 more. But there's also another option that was available in 1957 for the first time that was very significant for its day. Today we think of it as very normal, but back then it was pretty important in terms of what was going on within the American automotive world, and that was fuel injection. They offered a Rochester fuel injection option. Now, if you just wanted the 250 horsepower version of that, that was going to cost you $484. But now remember, this was a 283 cubic inch engine. They also offered a 283 horsepower edition. Now, the reality is it might have been 289, 286, who knows what the actual number was, but they made sure it aligned with 283. And if you did that, well, that was a pretty expensive option, $675. Now, the reality is not an awful lot of people did that, but a huge number of people said, you know what, I want that V8 engine. That's exactly what I want underneath the hood. And of course, a lot of people at that point were deciding they wanted automatic transmissions. I mean, yeah, it came with a classic 3 on the tree, but if you wanted the overdrive, it cost you a little bit more. You get the Power Glide, or you get what's called the Turbo Glide. That was about a $250 option. Made that up to positive traction in the back. I think that was costing almost $50. Together with dual exhaust, which were only $16, you had quite a package. If you got that high carburation setting, right, with 270 horsepower, dual exhaust, positive traction, everything you wanted to make this Chevrolet pick up and move. It had performance and it had great style. The interior on this 1957 Chevrolet is both similar and different at the same time from the 1956 model. The seats ultimately basically the same, although there were a lot more patterns and styles you could pick. But the big significant difference and change in the 1957 over the 1956 was the dashboard. A brand new look. Remember in the 55 and 56, very similar. It had that little curved top. In fact, the curve was on both sides of the dashboard. For the 1957, they changed to really what they consider jet age styling. Some people call this the flight panel. Some people call it the command post. Whatever you call it, the desire was to make people feel that they were in a jet aircraft, something, you know, that required you to, you know, be flying at 35,000 feet and, you know, 285 miles an hour or whatever aircraft were flying at back then. But once again, it was just a subtle styling change that they were able to do. And you got to remember, this is essentially a one-year dashboard that they did for this particular year. But for 1957, to change the styling, to make people think that it was different and new, because that was the big goal back then. Remember, every year the car had to be different, so that if the Jones had a 1956 and you came back with a 1957, oh, that was going to be completely different. Another significant thing about the 1957 Chevrolet was the style associated with the color combinations. There were actually 460 different color pattern combinations that you could get for this 1957 Chevrolet. Two-tone paint on the outside, different patterns, different styles. A lot of times people will look at the fabric inside a 1957 Chevrolet and just assume that, well, I mean, that must be some kind of custom touch. No, this is actually the way it came from the factory, if you can imagine that back then. So once again, the 1957 Chevrolet had everything. It had that styling on the outside. It had this, flight panel gauge cluster inside, that jet age look, all the style. And it's important to point out, when you were behind the wheel on this thing got up and moved. I mean, you could get this thing up to like 0 to 60 in less than 10 seconds, which for the 1957 year was pretty solid performance. It's important to remember that back in the 1950s, you didn't have a compact and a mid-size and a full-size. If you were buying a Chevrolet for your family and you didn't want a Corvette, you wanted something you could haul the kids around in, this was the Chevrolet that you were going to buy. But there were different models of this Chevrolet that you could buy. You'd start off with the base model. That was what was called the 150. It priced around $1,825 or so. If you were trying to save money, you bought that. If your business was buying you a car to drive around in, that's probably what you would drive around in. If you go look at old military cars or government cars from the 1950s, they were almost always 150 model Chevrolets. If you wanted to spend a little more money, say about $300 more or so, you could bump up to the mid-range. That was the 210. A little more style, a little more color combination that you could get with that, but still not quite at the level of the Bel Air. The Bel Air was the top of the line. It had more style. It had that gold touches that you got at the front and the back and some of the scripting that they put in, more color combinations, and most importantly, more style. And even within the Bel Air line, there were some different kind of vehicles that you could get. For example, this is a two-door car, right? A two-door coupe. Well, this is what's called a two-door sport coupe. You could also get a two-door sedan. Now, a two-door sedan has basically, we sometimes call them post cars, has a little pillar right here. If I were to roll down the window on this one though, well, there is no pillar here because this is the sport coupe. When you rolled this window down and that window down, there was no big ugly post that was blocking your view or something that looked quite as obnoxious. But interesting to realize that in 1957, you had two different coupes that you could buy that essentially had the same look except for that teeny tiny little difference between them. Now, there was also a couple of other cars you could buy. You could buy the convertible. The convertible, well, that was going to set you back definitely more, but the top of the line, if you were going to spend the most money in 1957, you were going to buy a Nomad wagon. Now, the Nomad was interesting. It had evolved from the Motorama show car, which really was based off the Corvette design, but ultimately they decided to put it onto this body right here. And it was a two-door station wagon. That would seem strange today, right? Just two doors. Why wouldn't you have two doors and four doors so you could get into the back? But had much more styling than even the station wagons that you could get for 1957. If you did that, the Nomad wagon was like around $2,750. So it was the most expensive of the vehicles that you could buy in 1957. It was not the most popular. They didn't sell a massive number of them, but it did add to the total number of cars that were sold in 1957. And once again, whether you wanted the two-door, the four-door, whether you wanted the Post, whether you didn't want the Post, if you wanted the style, the Bel Air was the way to go. All right, now it's time to answer that question of why I think this 1957 Chevrolet became the icon of the 1950s from an automotive perspective. And yes, a lot has to do with the styling. I mean, it's actually a great way to kind of take that mid-1950s, that shoebox Chevy, the slab-side Chevy, and take it up to that next notch before they go to the 1958 body style, which is completely different, only a one-year body style. And then, of course, the 1959, which goes in a whole new direction. So the styling was part of it. But to be honest with you, I think a significant reason that this car became an icon of the 1950s had to do with what's under the hood. I talked about that small block Chevy that they created in 1955, and they punched it out to 283 cubic inches for this year. That engine, that small block engine, was such a great engine. It just breathed right. It created the right amount of horsepower, the right amount of performance. It was easy to work on, and it just seemed to last forever. As a result, an awful lot of these 1957 Chevys just kept going and going and going. And as a result, when people wanted to buy them used, well, guess what? They were still on the lot. They were still doing great. So because of the fact that people could buy them used, that gave them some extra popularity. Now, Chrysler had really great styling, but they had some build problems in the 1950s. It prevented them from, being able to take advantage of that. So yes, it was the styling, but it was also the fact that this 1957 styling was able to stay on the road even longer, and people were able to buy them and hot rod them and do more things with them because that 283, that small block Chevy engine under the hood, did such a great job of performing and lasting, and you could also modify it, easily bring up the horsepower on it. So it's underneath the hood, I think, that's the thing that really made the 1957 Chevrolet an icon, because people kept buying them for years and years on used car lots or just in the hot rod world. And that's why this 1957 Chevrolet is truly the icon and such an important chapter in the automotive evolution.